Rotero completo. You know that feeling when you think you've finally figured yourself out, when you believe you've reached a new level of awareness, a higher consciousness, only to realize weeks later that you're still making the same mistakes, still caught in the same patterns, still somehow being, controlled by forces you can't quite name? You sit there late at night, scrolling through your phone, promising yourself you'll stop, you'll be more present, you'll be more authentic, and yet morning comes and you're right back where you started. You read the books, you listen to the podcasts, you meditate, you journal, you try every technique and framework for personal growth, and still there's this nagging sense that something invisible is pulling your strings. You can feel it in your chest, that tightness when you're about to speak your truth but swallow it instead, that weight when you know you should do something different, but your body moves on autopilot toward the familiar pattern. What if I told you that consciousness has levels, and at each level there's a different form of power operating through you, and most people spend their entire lives thinking they're free when they're actually just dancing to a tune they never chose? What if the reason you can't break free isn't because you're weak or undisciplined, but because you don't yet see the invisible architecture of control that shapes your every thought and desire? Stay with me, because what I'm about to show, you will completely transform how you understand your own mind and your own freedom. There's a peculiar moment that arrives in the life of anyone who begins to pay attention, really pay attention, to their own existence. It usually comes late at night or in the shower or during a long drive when the mind has nowhere to hide. You're going about your day, performing your routines, playing your roles, and suddenly there's this crack in the facade, this brief glimpse behind the curtain. You realize you're not sure where your thoughts come from. You're not sure why you want what you want. You look at your life, at the person you've become, and you have this unsettling sensation that somehow you ended up here without ever really choosing it. The clothes you wear, the way you speak, the things you believe are important, even the way you love. None of it feels entirely yours. It feels borrowed, inherited, imposed. And in that moment, you catch a glimpse of something Michel Foucault spent his entire life trying to show us, that we are not as free as we think we are, that consciousness itself comes in layers, and each layer represents a different relationship with power. Most people live their entire lives at the first level of consciousness, what we might call the unconscious conformity. At this level, you don't even know you're being shaped. You think your preferences are natural, your desires authentic, your choices free. You wake up, go to work, consume entertainment, pursue relationships, and it all feels like it's coming from you, from some essential self that's just expressing itself in the world. But Foucault would ask you to look closer. Why do you feel shame about your body in exactly the ways that make you buy certain products? Why do you measure your worth by productivity in a world that profits from your constant labor? Why do you perform happiness on social media even when you're suffering? At this first level, power operates through complete invisibility. You can't resist what you can't see. You can't question what you don't know. Is there? The social norms, the cultural expectations, the disciplinary mechanisms that Foucault wrote about, they're not forcing you to comply. They're teaching you to want to comply, to desire your own conformity, to police yourself more effectively than any external authority ever could. You've internalized the surveillance. You've become your own warden. And the most insidious part is that it feels like freedom. But then something shifts. Maybe it's a crisis, a loss, a betrayal, or just the slow accumulation of discomfort with yourself. You begin to wake up to the second level of consciousness, what we might call awareness of conditioning. Suddenly you start seeing the patterns. You notice how you change your personality depending on who's in the room. You catch yourself repeating phrases your parents used to say, phrases you swore you'd never repeat. You realize your career choice wasn't really yours, but something you pursued to make someone proud, or to fit an image of success you absorbed from movies and magazines. This is uncomfortable, deeply uncomfortable, because you're starting to see the puppet strings. Foucault called this the beginning of critique, this capacity to denaturalize what seems natural, to question what seems obvious. You're recognizing what he called the technologies of power, the subtle mechanisms through which you were taught to be a certain kind of person, the school system that trained you to sit still and follow instructions, the beauty standards that made you hate parts of your body, the economic system that convinced you that your value as a human being is tied to your productivity. You're waking up, but you're not free yet. Because awareness of conditioning is not the same as freedom from conditioning. You can see the cage now, but you're still inside it. At the third level of consciousness, something interesting happens. You decide to resist. You see the power structures, you understand how they shaped you, and you're determined to break free. This is what Foucault would recognize as the level of rebellion, but it's a particular kind of rebellion, what he might call reactive resistance. You define yourself in opposition to what you were taught. If society says be thin, you celebrate being fat. If culture says be successful, you reject ambition entirely. If your parents were religious, you become militantly atheist. If they were atheists, you find God. You think you're being free, but Foucault would gently point out that you're still being determined by what you're reacting against. Your identity is still built on the foundation of those power structures, just inverted. The cage is still there, you've just painted it a different color. This is a necessary stage, don't get me wrong. Rebellion matters, saying no matters. But it's not yet freedom in the deepest sense, because you're still letting external forces define the terms of your existence. You're still in a relationship with power, just a different kind of relationship. The question Foucault would ask is, can you move beyond both conformity and mere reaction? Can you reach a level of consciousness where you're not just resisting what was given to you, but actively creating something new? The fourth level is where things get really interesting, where many spiritual seekers and philosophers get stuck thinking they've arrived when they're only halfway there. This is the level of detachment, of rising above, of transcending the game. You study Buddhism, read Stoicism, practice meditation, and you learn to observe your thoughts without identifying with them. You cultivate equanimity. You stop caring what people think. You detach from outcomes, from desires, from the whole messy business of being a self in the world. And there's tremendous peace in this, tremendous relief. You're no longer buffeted by every opinion, no, longer devastated by every setback. You've found a kind of inner sanctuary. But here's what Foucault would warn you about, and this is crucial. Detachment can become its own form of power, a more subtle kind of control. Because when you detach from caring about injustice, when you rise above the suffering of others in the name of inner peace, when you use spirituality to insulate yourself from the difficult work of engaging with the world, you're actually serving the existing power structures perfectly. You're becoming docile. You're removing yourself as a threat. The systems that oppress, people love it when the people who could resist choose instead to retreat into private enlightenment. Foucault spent years studying what he called techniques of the self, these practices of self-transformation, and he saw how they could be both liberating and pacifying. The question is not whether to practice detachment, but what you do with the freedom it gives you. Do you use it to check out or to show up more fully? The fifth level of consciousness is what Foucault called the care of the self, but it's easily misunderstood, so listen carefully. This is not self-care in the contemporary sense of bubble baths and positive affirmations, though those things have their place. The care of the self that Foucault describes, drawing on ancient Greek and Roman philosophy, is something far more radical. It's the understanding that you must actively, intentionally, courageously create yourself, not discover yourself, as if there's some true self hidden inside waiting to be found, but create yourself through practices, through choices, through what Foucault called an aesthetics of existence. At this level, you understand that you were shaped by power, yes, but you also understand, so, that you have power. Not power over others, but power to shape your own subjectivity, to decide who you want to become. This is where you stop asking what society expects of you and start asking what kind of person you want to be, what kind of life you want to create. You choose your practices, deliberately. You read certain books, cultivate certain friendships, develop certain habits, not because you should, not because they'll make you successful or admired, but because they shape you into someone you respect. This requires tremendous honesty, because you have to keep examining your motivations. Are you doing this practice to become free or to build a new ego? Are you choosing this path because it's truly yours, or because it makes you feel superior to people still caught in the matrix? The care of the self is daily work, unglamorous work, the work of paying attention to how you're being shaped and actively participating in that shaping. Now we approach the sixth level, and this is where most contemporary discussions of consciousness stop, but Foucault pushes us further. This is the level of parrhesia, a Greek term that means fearless speech, truth-telling, speaking, truth to power. At this level, your consciousness expands beyond yourself. You've done the work of understanding how power shaped you. You've detached from identification with those patterns. You've actively created yourself through deliberate practice, and now you feel a responsibility to speak, to engage, to challenge. But this isn't the reactive rebellion of the third level. This is grounded courage. You're not speaking because you're angry at authority, but because you've seen something true, and you refuse to be silent about it. Parrhesia, as Foucault describes it, involves risk. The truth teller puts themselves in danger, potentially loses relationships, status, security, because they value truth and justice more than comfort. This level of consciousness understands that freedom is not just personal, but social, that your liberation is tied to the liberation of others, that you cannot be fully free in an unfree world. And here's the crucial thing: power is still operating at this level. Even when you speak truth, even when you challenge injustice, you're still working within systems of discourse, within structures of knowledge and power that precede you. But now you're aware of it. You're playing the game knowing it's a game, using the tools of power to challenge power itself. You're in the world, but not of it, engaged but not naive. And then there's a seventh level, one that Foucault himself was perhaps reaching toward in his final years, but never fully articulated. Because perhaps it can't be articulated, only lived. Let's call it fluid selfhood, or what some Buddhist traditions might call no-self, but understood through a Foucauldian lens. At this level, you've integrated all the previous levels. You understand conditioning, you can resist when necessary, you can detach when useful, you actively create yourself. You speak truth fearlessly, and yet, and this is the paradox, you also hold it all lightly. You recognize that even the self you've so carefully created is just another construct, another story, another temporary arrangement of power and knowledge. You are simultaneously the sculptor and the sculpture, the creator and the created, and you know that both are illusions pointing towards something more fundamental. At this level, power no longer controls you because you no longer identify with any fixed position that power could control. You're water, not ice. You respond to each moment freshly, not from a defended identity, but from presence. You can be fierce when fierceness is needed, gentle when gentleness is needed, silent when silence is needed, and it's not a performance, not a strategy, just a natural expression of someone who has remembered they are process, not product. This doesn't mean you're passive or disconnected. Quite the opposite. You're more engaged than ever, but without attachment to outcomes. You act ethically, not because you're trying to be good, but because causing unnecessary suffering is as absurd as hitting yourself in the face. Power structures still exist around you, still try to shape you, but they're like waves hitting a cliff that has learned to let the water pass through it. I once knew someone, a philosophy professor actually, who spent 20 years teaching Foucault, writing papers about power and resistance, leading seminars on technologies of the self, and by all academic measures was an expert on these concepts. But in their personal life, they were miserable. They had internalized every critical lens, could deconstruct any belief or practice, could see power operating everywhere, and it had left them paralyzed, cynical, unable to commit to anything or anyone because everything was just another power game. They came to me after a breakdown and said something I'll never forget. They said, "I understand consciousness. I can analyze it, theorize it, write about it, but I don't know how to live it." And that's when their real transformation began, not when they learned more theory, but when they started practicing, when they stopped just thinking about the care of the self and started actually caring for themselves, not as an academic exercise, but as a daily devotion. They began small, a morning routine of writing that was just for them, not for publication, relationships where they practiced vulnerability instead of critique, Moments of allowing joy without immediately deconstructing it. And slowly, something shifted. The knowledge they had in their head began to inhabit their body. They moved through the levels not in a linear way, but in a spiral, revisiting each one with more depth. Last time I spoke with them, they said something profound. They said they finally understood that Foucault's project wasn't about escaping power, because you can't. Power is everywhere. Power is productive. Power is what makes us. The project is about changing your relationship with power, about becoming aware enough to choose, conscious enough to create, free enough to speak, and light enough to dance with it all. If you're watching this and recognizing yourself at one of these levels, first I want you to know that there's no shame in wherever you are. These levels aren't a hierarchy where higher equals better in any absolute sense. They're more like different rooms in the same house, and sometimes you need to visit old rooms to understand new ones. If you're at the first level, still largely unconscious, the very fact that you're watching this suggests something is waking up in you. Be patient with the discomfort that's coming. If you're at the second level, seeing the conditioning, don't despair in the overwhelm of it. The fact that you can see the cage means there's something in you that's already outside of it, looking in. If you're at the third level, rebelling, celebrate your no, honor your resistance, but start asking what you're saying yes to. If you're at the fourth level, practicing detachment, make sure your peace isn't becoming a prison of its own. If you're at the fifth level, caring for yourself, keep interrogating your motives, keep choosing practices that actually liberate you. If you're at the sixth level, speaking truth, protect your capacity for joy so your activism doesn't become another form of suffering. And if you're touching that seventh level, you probably won't tell anyone, because what would you say? You'll just live differently, love differently, show up differently, and maybe, just maybe, help others find their own way through these levels. The thing about consciousness is that it's not a destination. Foucault would laugh at the idea that you could arrive somewhere and be done. Even he, this brilliant philosopher who spent his life studying power, was still discovering new things about himself, still making mistakes, still evolving until his death. And that's actually the good news, the hopeful news that gets lost in our culture's obsession with final answers and complete solutions. You don't have to be perfect. You don't have to transcend everything. You just have to keep paying attention, keep choosing more awareness, keep practicing freedom in small ways every day, the power. The structures will always be there trying to shape you, and sometimes they'll succeed. You'll catch yourself performing, conforming, hiding, repeating old patterns. But if you've developed the capacity to notice, if you've cultivated that witnessing awareness that can see when you're being controlled, then in that very moment of seeing, you've already taken back some power. Not power over your circumstances necessarily, but power over your response to your circumstances. And that's where freedom lives, not in some transcendent realm beyond the human condition, but right here, in the gap between stimulus and response, in the space where you can pause and choose. So here's what I want to leave you with. Power will always try to control you. That's not a problem to be solved, it's a fact to be worked with. The question is not whether you'll be shaped by power, because you will, we all are, constantly. The question is, at which level of consciousness are you relating to that power? Are you asleep to it, rebelling against it, detached from it, creating with it, challenging it, or dancing with it? And here's the real secret that Foucault spent his whole career pointing toward. You move through these levels not by achieving some state of permanent enlightenment, but by practicing specific techniques, specific ways of thinking and acting that gradually expand your awareness and your freedom. Reading becomes a practice when you read to transform yourself, not just to acquire information. Writing becomes a practice when you use it to know yourself more deeply, not just to be known by others. Meditation becomes a practice when it helps you see your patterns, not just feel good. Conversation becomes a practice when you speak your truth, even when your voice shakes. These practices are what Foucault called technologies of the self, and they're not about following rules or achieving goals. They're about incrementally freeing yourself from invisible controls by making them visible, then choosing something different. The work is daily, the work is imperfect, the work is the Also the only game worth playing. Because what else are you going to do with this one precious life except try to live it as freely, as consciously, as authentically as you possibly can? If this video spoke to something real in you, if you felt that recognition, that yes, this is what I've been trying to understand, then leave a like so others who are searching for these ideas can find them. Subscribe to this channel because every week we're going to keep exploring these deep questions about consciousness, power, freedom, and transformation through the lens of philosophy and lived experience. This isn't content for passive consumption, it's fuel for active transformation. And drop a comment sharing which level resonates most with where you are right now, because your journey matters, your awareness matters, and by sharing it, you help others feel less alone in their own struggle toward freedom. Remember, you're not trying to escape the human condition, you're trying to live it fully awake. And that work, that beautiful, difficult, necessary work, starts right now, in this moment, with this breath, with this choice to pay attention. The cage is real, but so is the key. And the key is consciousness itself, developing through levels, deepening through practice, moving you slowly but surely toward a freedom that power can never fully control. That's where we're going together. That's what this channel is about, and I'm grateful you're here for the journey.